morning, everyone. We are Group 42. My name is Cory Sawchuck. Today we have with us Tyler Luini, Stephen Feser, Tong Wang, and Shawn MacNabb. The presentation we'll be giving you today is on firearms. For the agenda today, we will be talking about the history of firearms. We will also be talking about some research and statistics we've done to compile this presentation. And why does this presentation matter to you? And then we will wrap it all up in the end. So first we thought we'd start you off with some ethical dilemmas about firearms, some questions we want you to think through the presentation. The first one that we came up with was, do firearms have a positive or negative impact on society? Another one that we want you to think is, who should own a firearm? And lastly, what is your view at the end of this presentation on firearms?
Firearms have been around and used for various purposes since the 1300s. This was made possible by explosive powder, which was developed separately by the Chinese and English alchemist Roger Bacon. Shortly after its discovery, it was used in the creation of cannons. It wasn't until the 1400s that the first handheld firearm was created. This muzzle-loaded firearm operated in the same manner as a cannon, but on a smaller scale. These early versions used a serpentine mechanism to put a burning wick into the flash pan to fire the projectile. However, these early firearms failed in the wind and the rain. In the 1600s, two new improved firearm mechanisms were introduced. The first was a wheel-lock system, which operates like a modern cigarette lighter. These mechanisms were complex and expensive to produce. The other mechanism created was the flintlock, which produced a spark using flint and steel. The flint would wear out or break often, and the springs were prone to fail. The biggest step in creating modern firearms came in the 1800s with the development of percussion caps. These were small caps containing explosive material which would ignite upon impact. These were used on firearms at the time as the firing mechanism. Early attempts to improve firearm reload times and reliability by having the shot loaded from the back failed as too much gas escaped from this breech. Cartridges were developed to solve this issue. These contained the powder, bullet, and percussion cap together. These had 4 advantages, including easy loading, gas leakage prevention. They were largely weatherproof and were more reliable. After the invention of cartridges, mass production of firearms was made possible. Firearms in Canada have been used since the 1500s and were key in developing the fur trade economy in which Canada was built upon. Firearms in Canada are regulated by the Firearms Act and Part 3 of the Criminal Code. These set the regulations on proper storage, handling, acquisition, and use. A possession and acquisitions license, or PAL, is needed to buy or use firearms. To get a PAL, a person needs to take a written test and a practical test, which ensure they have the proper knowledge on how to use a firearm. In addition, a background check by the RCMP is required before approval. There are 3 different PAL classes which correspond to different types of firearms with different methods of attaining these licenses. A non-restricted PAL allows a person to buy and use hunting rifles and shotguns. A restricted PAL allows a person to acquire handguns and shorter barrel weapons for recreational use. Restricted firearms are more strictly regulated by the government. The last type of firearms falls under the prohibited class. These include very small barrel weapons and automatic firearms. The general public cannot get a prohibited firearm license. These licenses are used mainly by enforcement agencies like the RCMP or the Canadian Army.
Firearms can be used to protect yourself and others. Self-defense against unprovoked assault is protected under the law, such as Section 34 of the Criminal Code of Canada. A study showed that most defensive firearm uses do not cause any harm. They were used for warning without shooting. Only 16% of the time the gun was fired, and 8% of the time it wounded or killed the offender. In Canadian economy, the shooting industry is worth $8.9 billion. 1.8 million Canadians practiced shooting sports in 2018, such as target shooting and hunting. With 1.3 million Canadian hunters, the hunting industry supported 33,000 full-time jobs and $2 billion in labor income. In the American economy, the firearm industry is worth more than $50 billion. Put into perspective, it's about 1/10 of the automobile industry's economic impact. Furthermore, 37% of American households own guns. The industry provided more than 300,000 jobs and over $15 billion in labor income.
Whether and to what extent guns encourage violence has been a hot topic for decades. It's a very complicated question and will not be attempted here. The majority of deaths involving guns is caused by suicide, and from 2004 to 2015, more homicides were caused by stabbings than with guns, with 1 in 4 homicides being gang-related. However, recently there was a growing trend of crime involving guns. Saskatchewan has the highest rate of firearm injuries in the country, with Saskatoon having the most violent crimes involving guns. Now, these are most likely due to the number of guns in the province, with an estimated 2 guns for every 5 people, which is the most in any province. There are many factors that are involved in mass shootings. However, many researchers agree there is a correlation between the number of guns in a society and the amount of public shootings. America by far has the highest rate of shootings than any Western country. In Canada, the homicide rates have been decreasing. However, the homicide rates by shooting have been increasing. In the past 25 years, Australia and South Africa have introduced gun control measures to curb the amount of guns, with Australia actually buying back guns. The amount of deaths by shootings have been decreasing in both these countries.
Over time, firearms have moved out of the battlefield and into the world of sports and recreation. Some notable sports that use firearms are skeet shooting, where a clay disc is thrown into the air for contestants to shoot; biathlon, an Olympic sport that combines skiing with long-distance target shooting; and speed shooting, where a contestant moves around a course, shooting various targets as fast as they can. Firearms are also used in competitive hunting, such as the North American Hunting Competition that was established in 2012. They are also used in recreational hunting, such as waterfowl hunting, which has been around for over 200 years. Even if you are a very anti-firearm person, we hope that you, as a future engineer, can walk away from this presentation with at least one lesson learned. That is, technology that spawns from violence does not necessarily have to stay associated with violence. For example, some of the first rockets built for space exploration were originally designed to be intercontinental ballistic missiles. We believe viable technical solutions may be ignored because of the projects or negative events they have been associated with. It is up to us, as future engineers, to discover productive, moral, and ethical uses for technologies that benefit society.
So, after hearing about all of our positive and negative views on firearms, we wanted to relate it back to the class. The first thing we want to discuss is utilitarianism. So, that means maximize goodness for all people. So, in this sense, firearms would be bad because, yes, you can hunt with them, and they're used for sport, but they're also used as a weapon to hurt other people for unnecessary or wrong reasons for just personal gain. So in this view, they're bad. But if we look at right ethics is that every person has a right to property, and this is what the U.S. follows. As in their Second Amendment, they have the right to bear arms. So they have the right to defend their property, defend their way of life. So in this sense, firearms are good. Another main issue with firearms is that it's the person that is using them and not the firearms themselves. So this ties into virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is people acquire their traits and their characteristics that are passed down. So if people are good and have a good characteristics and good traits, and their parents raised them to not use firearms poorly, then this wouldn't be an issue at all. So some recommendations after doing our research we have about firearms is that, first of all, U.S. should follow Canada's lead with respect to gun control. Canada doesn't have as much issues as the U.S. does in regards to the negative ways of firearms. Like one thing is that our registration for a firearm is a lot more in depth. We have to do detailed background checks, and then there's training involved as well. U.S. kind of has less strict policies on this. Another thing is that the firearms themselves aren't the issue. It's the people using them. So this is another recommendation is that society should look maybe more into the mental health of each person or even substance abuse, because these aren't the issues that are relating to firearms. So these are the references we used for our presentation. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to hearing from your questions.